Okay, let's start this with a bit of a thought experiment. What if I said that today I'm going to be talking about games that are like Contra? Which games would come immediately to mind? I imagine some of you would jump right to games like Metal Slug and Gunstar Heroes. Those are very similar to Contra. But other people might say, well, what do you mean by like Contra? Do you mean just a side-scrolling action game with a guy shooting stuff? What about Mega Man? Is that like Contra? Does it have to be side-scrolling? How about Commando or Gunsmoke? What about Doom? Is that like Contra? Wait, does it have to be a guy shooting stuff? What about Gradius? Is that like Contra? Okay, you guys need to calm down. But if I instead said that I'll be looking at games that are like Bubble Bobble, I imagine you would have a much clearer idea of the kinds of games I'm talking about, even if not many games jumped immediately to mind. Although I have a suspicion that you're probably already thinking of one or two games already. But just to make sure we're on the same page, I'm going to briefly outline what it means for a game to be like Bubble Bobble, at least from my perspective. And the thing is, we can get really specific about this because, as it turns out, making games that were like Bubble Bobble was practically a cottage industry for a minute. A Bubble Bobble-like game is a single-screen arcade platformer where the goal is to defeat all the enemies on the screen. And the manner in which you clear all the enemies out is one of the defining characteristics of the genre. See, you don't directly take them out, you have kind of a 1-2 approach to defeating them. For example, in Bubble Bobble, you first trap an enemy in a bubble, and then you have to take the additional step of popping said bubble to completely remove the enemy from the playfield. If you don't pop the bubble quickly enough, the enemy will escape and become a real nuisance. However, the player is incentivized to delay this second step for a while in order to trap additional enemies, as taking out multiple enemies at once will result in bonus points. Now, being an arcade game, a multiplayer aspect is a natural component of these games, and this is possibly my favorite kind of multiplayer, where on the surface it seems cooperative as both players are working together towards a common goal, but in reality the two players are still in competition. Teamwork and cooperation is all well and good, but at the end of the day, the game is still going to use each player's score to separate the winner from the loser. Now, up to this point, everything I've just said pretty much describes the Mario Brothers style of game. You know, like the bonus levels from Super Mario Bros. 3. And in fact, it wouldn't surprise me if Mario Bros. Was one of the original inspirations of Bubble Bobble. But Mario Bros. Is more or less an endless high score challenge, with very little variance, if any, from one screen to the next. The Bubble Bobble-Likes, on the other hand, may feel endless, but every stage is unique, and there is, in fact, an ending to the game. Another characteristic of Bubble Bobble-like games are cute characters and colorful graphics, and having a catchy soundtrack is a nice bonus. So now that the criteria has been established, let's look at games on the Game Boy that were like Bubble Bobble. Now, as long as we're talking about Game Boy games that were similar to Bubble Bobble, probably one of the best examples is Bubble Bobble. And this one, at least at a glance, certainly seems to be a dead ringer. You have the 1-2 approach to taking out enemies, you have the cute and cartoony graphics and the catchy music, although this version isn't quite as nice on the ears as other versions I've heard. This appears to be more or less the same as the NES version, which I imagine is the main version most people have played, although one of the main differences is the introduction of frequent boss battles. But the bosses aren't the main difference you'll find in the Game Boy version of Bubble Bobble. The first thing I noticed, and I'm sure the first thing you noticed as well, is that the perspective has been zoomed in, so you can only see a fraction of the screen at any given time. In past videos, I've talked about how the size of the Game Boy screen presented a challenge to developers who were trying to create Game Boy versions of popular NES games. The Game Boy was capable of essentially the same graphics as the NES, but the number of pixels on the Game Boy screen was about half of what the NES was displaying on your television screen. This means that NES accurate sprites appeared twice as large on the Game Boy screen. And the result was games that looked pretty great, but were often frustrating to play because of how small and cramped the play area was. The alternative was to recreate the familiar NES sprites using half the number of pixels, which may have allowed the Game Boy versions to play more like their console counterparts, but they weren't as visually appealing. Remember that at this time, information about any particular game was far more limited than it is right now, and the decision of whether or not to buy a game often came down to how it looked in screenshots in a magazine advertisement or on the back of the box. And no one wants to buy games with bad graphics, or at least that's what most publishers probably thought. If you got the game home and you found that it didn't play nearly as good as it looked, well, that was your problem. However, this wasn't too much of an issue for action games. The Game Boy versions of games like Battletoads and Mega Man may have been a little awkward in some spots, but they were still reasonably playable. But the console versions of Battletoads and Mega Man weren't single-screen arcade games, where knowing the locations of all the active enemies at all times was a major part of the gameplay. Imagine playing Donkey Kong, except half the play area was kept permanently off screen, so you could never see oncoming barrels and fireballs until they were right on top of you. Does that sound fun? I bet it doesn't, but that's exactly how the Game Boy version of Bubble Bobble plays. When the only goal in the game is to dispatch all the bad guys in the room, you can imagine how much of an impact it has on the gameplay when you have a blind spot that covers half the stage. It's not that it makes the game unplayable, but it does introduce a level of challenge that wasn't present in the original arcade game or the NES port. Now, I'm not going to make a habit of doing this, but let's briefly take a look at the version of Bubble Bobble that appeared on the Sega Game Gear. Notice how the layout of the rooms was shrunken down in such a way that the full stage could be displayed on the screen. Despite being slightly less faithful to the original stage structure than the Game Boy version, the Game Gear version of Bubble Bobble more accurately reproduced the experience of playing the original game. Now granted, the Game Gear had a 160 by 144 pixel display, which was significantly larger than the Game Boy screen. Oh wait, no, the Game Boy also had a 160 by 144 pixel display. So there's really no good reason why, colorization aside, these two versions of Bubble Bobble couldn't have looked and played more or less identically. And it's worth mentioning that the Game Gear version of Bubble Bobble also allows for 2 players, whereas the Game Boy version is 1 player only. Now, do any of these complaints make Bubble Bobble on the Game Boy a bad game? I wouldn't necessarily say so, and in fact there are some aspects of this version that I think actually improve on the arcade and NES versions of the game. But the failings of Bubble Bobble on the Game Boy outweigh its triumphs, so if you're looking for a faithful adaptation of the game on the go, you might need to look elsewhere. Mr. Chin's Gourmet Paradise is a very strange game. As Mr. Chin, you have to clear all the enemies in each stage by eating them. Most of the enemies appear as these spiky fireball things called momos, which are deadly to the touch. Although actually, I'm not sure if they are deadly or not. If you touch one, you fly off the screen in the familiar losing a life fashion. But when you run out of lives, the game over screen shows that Mr. Chin has been sent to jail. So I'm not sure exactly what is happening. According to the full page the manual dedicates to establishing the premise of the game, it's apparently illegal to hunt momos, so it's heavily implied that we're playing as the bad guy in this game. Now, in order to eat the momos, you have to blast them with this transformation beam, which turns them into edible peaches. You activate the beam by setting up 2 transmitters on the same level. The transformation beam will activate as soon as the second transmitter has been set in place, and any momos caught between the 2 transmitters will be zapped into peaches. As it happens, the cover artwork does a pretty good job of conveying exactly what happens in the game, although Mr. Chin definitely appears more svelte and youthful on the box than he does in the actual game. Although only 4 enemies appear on the screen at any one time, the total number of momos that you need to deal with in each stage is shown here, which conveniently counts down as you remove them from play. After every couple stages, you'll encounter a bonus stage, where you're given a strict time limit to eat as many peaches as possible. Although you could just run around eating the peaches one after the other, it didn't really take me too long to figure out that if you just climb up to the top of the screen, you can position yourself right where the peaches drop into the stage, which not only dramatically increases your score, or calorie intake, but it's also kind of hilarious. Although I'd still ultimately compare this game to Bubble Bobble, it seems to draw more inspiration from the original Mario Bros. Like Bubble Bobble, every stage in the game is unique, but the game follows the Mario Bros. Format by ultimately being an endless high score challenge. The game loops after stage 8, and you repeat this ad nauseum until you finally exhaust all your lives. Also, like in Mario Bros., the enemies appear at the top of the stage and work their way downward towards the pipe at the bottom of the screen, which then warps them back up to the top of the stage. Mr. Chin himself also behaves like Mario. He could break blocks by jumping into them from below, and even discover power-ups, like a steamed dumpling that will give you temporary invincibility, or a bomb that will immediately turn all the momos on the screen into peaches. Mr. Chin doesn't control anywhere near as nicely as Mario does though. Although you can eventually get used to Mr. Chin's weird sense of weight and momentum, it's much harder to get used to how finicky the platforming is, specifically when trying to jump up to a platform above you. It feels like most times, even when it seems like you have plenty of open space above you, you'll hit the blocks of the platform above you far more often than you'll jump onto it, which is pretty irritating. I don't like that. Unlike the other games I'm talking about today, Mr. Chin's Gourmet Paradise appears to have been designed exclusively for the Game Boy. It didn't appear on any other systems, and it doesn't seem to be an adaptation of any existing console or arcade game. But don't make the mistake of thinking that this game is any kind of hidden gem. Despite having some reasonably pleasant graphics, a few catchy music tracks, and a gameplay hook that I guess I would describe as unique, Mr. Chin's Gourmet Paradise isn't especially fun or interesting, and the fussy controls make the game far more frustrating than challenging. I imagine Snow Brothers is the most common game to come to mind when the topic of Bubble Bobble-like games is brought up, because it isn't just similar to Bubble Bobble, it is an unabashed clone of Bubble Bobble in almost every way. Now before I say anything else, I need to address the fact that finally, there's a game that squeezes the entire play area into a single screen. Despite the fact that everything you're seeing here is constructed out of about half the number of pixels that you find on the NES version, you can't deny that the game still looks pretty decent. As I just mentioned, the game doesn't stray very far from the Bubble Bobble formula, with a few key differences that make it feel as unique from Bubble Bobble as Balloon Fight was from Joust. First off, the title of the game is a bit of a misnomer. The arcade and console versions of the game, just like Bubble Bobble, were capable of simultaneous multiplayer, thus justifying the Snow Brothers name. But the Game Boy version, just like the Game Boy version of Bubble Bobble, is a single player only experience. As the lone Snow Brother, you fling snow at enemies to trap them in giant snowballs. Kicking the snowballs will send them barreling down towards the bottom of the screen, bowling over any bad guys caught in their path. Defeated enemies will drop bonus items like candy and money bags, and occasionally they'll drop these power-up bottles, which provide the same types of upgrades that the candies give you in Bubble Bobble, allowing you to move faster or increasing the distance and power of your snowballs. There's even a power-up that will cause you to blow up like a balloon and become invincible, letting you float all over the screen and knock out the bad guys with a single touch. By the way, from the look on the snowman's face, this does not look like a pleasant experience at all. I'm pretty sure he hates this. Once you defeat all the enemies in the room, you'll move on to the next floor. In the console versions of the game, there's actually an animation as you flip up to the next level, but in the Game Boy version, you just kind of warp there. For what it's worth, the Game Boy version of Bubble Bobble still had the animation of moving from one floor to the next, so I suppose there's one point in Bubble Bobble's favor. There are a total of 60 floors in the game, with a boss fight appearing on every 10th floor. All in all, Snow Brothers is a pretty fun game, providing that you like games like this, and really, who doesn't like Bubble Bobble? Granted, just like the Game Boy version of Bubble Bobble, I couldn't possibly recommend playing this version over the console versions, assuming you have that option. But if you're craving that Bubble Bobble action on the go, I think Snow Brothers is the way to go. The gameplay might be lifted wholesale from Bubble Bobble, but it still has enough of its own unique personality and energy that it stands well enough on its own. The music is also quite good, with a variety of catchy themes that don't grate on the eardrums. However, despite how easy it would be to say that Snow Brothers wins the Bubble Bobble contest, there's a few things that drag the game down a bit. For one thing, the central mechanic of mashing the attack button to bury enemies in snow isn't nearly as quick and satisfying as trapping them in a bubble with a single shot. Even after you've gotten a few power-ups, you still have to hit enemies multiple times to trap them completely. Considering how long the game is, you'll likely get tired of button mashing long before the game ends. And on that note, the length of the game is also kind of an issue. Snow Brothers expects you to finish the game on a single sitting, which will probably take an hour or more for a casual playthrough. That's a pretty long time to spend with a game like this without any breaks. Even with the frequent boss battles, the gameplay still has a tendency to feel a bit repetitive after a while. Providing players with a password every so often would have been more in keeping with the spirit of portable gaming, allowing players to play for shorter periods of time without losing their progress. Now, believe it or not, there are actually more Bubble Bobble-like games on the Game Boy. But that's all we're going to talk about today. Until next time, thank you for watching The Good, the Bad, and the Game Boy.